Name the only American general in World War II who made 4 combat jumps. Not 2, not 3, 4. The man who was first out the airplane door every single time, who carried an enlisted man's rifle instead of the officer's carbine because he refused to pretend he was anything other than one of his own troops. The man who wrote the Army's first field manual on airborne warfare and then jumped into combat to prove every word of it, who commanded the 82nd Airborne Division at 37 years old, the youngest American to command a division since George Armstrong Custer, and over 422 days of combat across 7 campaigns from Sicily to Berlin, never gave back a single foot of ground his division took. Not once. You cannot name him. Almost nobody can. Because when people talk about the airborne in World War II, they talk about Bastogne, they talk about Band of Brothers, they talk about the 101st Airborne and Easy Company, and the specific cultural real estate that a television series can claim and hold forever. And they skip right past the man who did it first, did it more, and did it longer than anyone else in the European theater. His name was James Gavin, and this is where he came from. His birth certificate reads, James Nally Ryan, with the middle name crossed out. His mother was likely an Irish immigrant named Catherine Ryan. His father may have been a man named James Nally, though the records are deliberately vague in the way records are vague when nobody involved wanted them examined. Both parents either died or gave him up before he turned 2. By 1909, he was living in the Convent of Mercy Orphanage in Brooklyn, a baby with no name anyone intended to keep. That same year, Martin and Mary Gavin, a working-class Irish immigrant couple in Mount Carmel, Pennsylvania, deep in the anthracite coal country, adopted him. Martin Gavin was a coal miner who could barely read or write. At least one biographer describes Mary as an abusive alcoholic and Martin as passive. Gavin later said of them, diplomatically, that his parents were kind people who could hardly read or write. He never spoke about them in detail. He never went back. By 10 years old, he was delivering newspapers. By 11, he held 2 routes and served as agent for 3 out-of-town papers, devouring the World War I headlines he carried. That he became obsessed with the Civil War, specifically with how commanders could control the movements of thousands of men across vast distances. He left school after the 8th grade and worked full-time, first as a shoe store clerk earning $12.50 a week, then briefly managing for a small oil company. He was terrified of exactly one future, becoming a coal miner like his father, going underground, staying there until the mine took him. On March 22, 1924, his 17th birthday, Gavin ran away from home. He took the night train to New York City, and his first act was to send a telegram to his adoptive parents assuring them he was alive. At the recruiting station, he was underage and needed parental consent. His solution was characteristically direct. He told the recruiter he was an orphan. The recruiter gathered the underage orphan boys together, took them to a lawyer who declared himself their legal guardian, and signed the consent papers. On April 1, 1924, James Gavin raised his right hand at the Whitehall building in Manhattan and became a private in the United States Army. He later recalled simply that he could not wait to join up. What happened next should have taken 20 years of a normal Army career. Gavin compressed it into 12. His pre-war assignments read like a graduate seminar in 20th century warfare. At Fort Benning Infantry School, he studied under George Marshall, then the Commandant, and Joseph Stilwell, head of the Tactics Department. Stillwell taught him a principle he never abandoned for the rest of his life. Anything you ask the troops to do, you must be able to do yourself. And at Fort Sill under Leslie McNair, he devoured the writings of J.F.C. Fuller on armor, air power, and mobility. In the Philippines, he grew alarmed at American unpreparedness and wrote that their weapons and equipment were no better than those used in World War I. The real turning point came in 1939 when he was assigned to the West Point Tactics faculty and tasked with analyzing the German Blitzkrieg. He studied the Fallschirmjäger, the German paratroopers, at Eben Emael in Norway and on Crete. He devoured everything available on Soviet parachute experiments from the 1930s. And he became convinced that airborne forces combined with tactical mobility represented the future of warfare, not just dropping men from the sky, but redesigning how armies used those men after they landed. The concept he was developing was not about spectacle. It was about paralysis. Drop a concentrated force behind enemy lines at night, at key terrain, with clear objectives and aggressive leadership on the ground, and you could freeze an entire army's rear area while conventional forces hit from the front. The key was speed, violence, and the absolute refusal to give back anything you took. In August 1941, Gavin volunteered for parachute school at Fort Benning. He was 34 years old. Most officers his age were angling for safe staff positions. As the Army expanded toward 1 million men, Gavin wanted to jump out of airplanes. He completed the 3-week course, made his 5 qualifying jumps, and immediately took command of a company in the 503rd Parachute Infantry Battalion, one of the earliest American parachute units in existence. There were fewer than 5,000 paratroopers in the entire United States Army at that point. The concept was still considered experimental by most senior leadership, and many generals openly argued it was a waste of resources. The Germans had proven at Crete that paratroopers suffered catastrophic casualties in the drop phase and could never carry enough heavy weapons to fight conventional armor on the ground. Gavin disagreed, and he had studied Crete more carefully than the skeptics. The problem wasn't the concept. The problem was the execution. The Germans had dropped men piecemeal without coordination into prepared defenses. Gavin believed in concentration, surprise, and the one principle that would define his entire career: get on the ground, seize the objective, hold until relieved, and never under any circumstances give it back. Yet then he did something that separated him from every other brave volunteer in the Airborne program. He wrote Field Manual 31-30, Tactics and Technique of Airborne Troops, the United States Army's first field manual on airborne warfare. He synthesized Soviet drop experiments, German combat experience from Crete and the Low Countries, and his own tactical thinking into the document that would govern how America fought from the sky. When later asked what made his career accelerate so fast, his answer was blunt: "I wrote the book. That detail matters more than most people realize. Plenty of officers volunteered for the Airborne. Plenty were brave." Gavin was different because he was an intellectual and a fighter simultaneously. He didn't just want to jump out of airplanes. He wanted to redesign the entire concept of vertical envelopment. Oh, that combination, the thinker who also carries a rifle, is vanishingly rare in any military in any era. He assumed command of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment in August 1942 at age 35 and built it from nothing. His rules were absolute. Officers will be first out of the airplane door and last in the chow line. Officers carried the M1 Garand, the standard enlisted weapon, not the lighter M1 carbine issued to most officers elsewhere in the Army. The symbolism was deliberate, and the message was simple: if you command paratroopers, you are a paratrooper. His final training test was a 50-mile forced march in 36 hours, marching all night, maneuvering all day, seizing and defending an airhead, sleeping for 1 hour, then resuming the march, all carrying full combat loads on reserve rations. His chief of staff described the result with a sentence that tells you everything about what Gavin had created. They were awesome, every man a clone of the CO, tough not just in the field, but 24 hours a day. The 505th joined the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg in February 1943. They departed New York Harbor on April 29th and reached Casablanca on May 10th. 2 months later, everything Gavin had built would be tested for the first time. On the night of July 9th, 1943, Colonel Gavin led the 505th Parachute Regimental Combat Team, 3,400 men aboard 226 C-47 transports, toward southeastern Sicily in Operation Husky. Their mission was to seize strategic crossroads behind enemy lines, blocking German armor reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches. The drop was a catastrophe. Winds of 35 miles per hour, more than double the safe training limit, combined with inexperienced troop carrier pilots who had never flown a combat mission, scattered paratroopers across 60 miles of southeastern Sicily. Some men landed 25 miles from the intended drop zone. Others came down in the sea and drowned. Gavin himself could not determine whether he had landed in Sicily, Italy, or the Balkans until he spotted distant shell fire and oriented himself. He assembled an initial group of fewer than 20 men and did what he would do for the rest of the war. He marched toward the sound of the guns. But here is what the Germans didn't understand. Despite the chaos, and likely because of it, small paratrooper groups operating independently behind enemy lines, cutting telephone wires, ambushing convoys, or establishing roadblocks at crossroads were so effective at creating confusion that German commanders estimated the airborne force at 10 times its actual strength. 3,400 scattered paratroopers were mistaken for a force of 30,000. The next night brought the worst friendly fire incident in American military history to that point. 144 C-47 transports carrying Colonel Reuben Tucker's 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment flew over the beachhead on a reinforcement mission. A nervous gunner aboard a naval vessel opened fire on the formation. Within seconds, the panic spread. Virtually every Allied naval vessel and ground unit along the coast joined in, pouring anti-aircraft fire into their own transports. 23 C-47s were shot down. 37 more were heavily damaged. The combined toll was 318 killed, wounded, and missing. Tucker's own aircraft flew the length of the Sicilian coast twice with more than 2,000 holes in its fuselage. That disaster led directly to the painted invasion stripes on Allied aircraft for D-Day and entirely new anti-aircraft fire protocols. And then came the action that made Gavin's reputation permanently, and which I believe is the single most important moment in his entire career, Piazza Ridge. Piazza Ridge was a strategic 100-foot elevation overlooking the road between German armor concentrations and the vulnerable 1st and 45th Infantry Division beachheads. If the Germans held it, their panzers had a clear path to push the entire invasion back into the sea. Gavin arrived with a platoon of combat engineers and attacked. Throughout the day, he assembled a scratch force from mixed units: regimental clerks, cooks, truck drivers, signalmen, anyone who could carry a weapon. Eventually, several hundred men. They faced the entire Eastern Task Force of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, at least 700 Luftwaffe infantry, an armored artillery battalion, and a company of 17 Tiger I heavy tanks, each mounting an 88mm cannon. Gavin had no tanks, no tank destroyers, no artillery support, and no communication with the beachhead. His men captured two 75mm pack howitzers and used them as direct-fire anti-tank weapons, aiming at the vulnerable underbellies of Tiger tanks as they reared up crossing a stone wall. One Tiger was knocked out this way. His order to his men was simple and absolute: "We are staying on this goddamn ridge no matter what happens." A trooper named Harold Eatman found Gavin in a shallow hole scraped into the shale out in front of the entire position. When Eatman gasped for water, Gavin offered his own canteen. "Here, son, take some of mine." By evening, 6 M4 Sherman tanks finally arrived from the 45th Infantry Division. At 8:30 that night, Gavin ordered a counterattack. The Hermann Göring Division retreated. According to the official Army history, the paratrooper stand at Piazza Ridge prompted the German commander to change his plans, pulling forces away from the 1st Division beachhead as well. Gavin was awarded his first Distinguished Service Cross and suffered a mortar fragment wound to the leg that he dismissed as unworthy of a Purple Heart. I keep returning to this battle because it established the template for everything that followed. A young colonel with no heavy weapons, no armor, and a collection of whoever he could grab, holding critical ground against a panzer division through sheer refusal to quit. That was the 82nd Airborne's identity. Not just bravery, calculated stubbornness, backed by improvisation. That was Gavin's entire philosophy of war, forged at Piazza Ridge and repeated at every engagement after. When the Salerno beachhead teetered on collapse 4 days into the September 1943 invasion, General Mark Clark called on the 82nd. His message to Ridgway was 3 words: "This is a must." On the night of September 13th, Tucker's 504th jumped onto the beachhead, guided by oil drums filled with gasoline-soaked sand ignited at 50-yard intervals. The next night, Gavin's 505th followed. And both drops were precise, a complete transformation from the chaos over Sicily. Within 24 hours, 2 parachute regiments had stabilized the faltering beachhead. The 82nd pushed forward and entered Naples on October 1st, 1943, the first major European city liberated by the Allies. The 504th remained in Italy for Anzio, where it earned one of the most famous nicknames in military history. A diary found on a dead German officer of the 1st Parachute Division read, "American parachutists, devils in baggy pants, are less than 100 meters from my outpost line. I cannot sleep at night. They pop up from nowhere, and we never know when or how they will strike next. Seems like the black-hearted devils are everywhere. On December 9th, 1943, Gavin was promoted to brigadier general at age 36. 6 months later, on the night of June 5th, 1944, he jumped into Normandy as the 82nd's assistant division commander. He was 37 years old. He was the first man out of his aircraft at approximately 2:15 in the morning on June 6, 1944. The Normandy drop was worse than Sicily. Only the veteran 505th landed near its assigned zone, with roughly 75% of sticks within a mile. The 507th had the worst drop of any regiment on D-Day. Only 3 sticks landed near the drop zone, and 180 paratroopers were dropped more than 20 kilometers away near a village where they would fight a doomed last stand against an entire German division. Many men drowned in the flooded Murderette River marshes, dragged under by equipment in as little as 2 feet of water. 60% of all heavy equipment, mortars, radios, demolition charges, ammunition resupply, was lost in scattered drops across the Norman countryside. After 24 hours, only about 2,000 of the 82nd's paratroopers were under division control, roughly 1/3 of the force that had jumped. Gavin landed in a pasture near the Mer d'Arrée, far from his drop zone. By 4 in the morning, he had assembled about 200 men and led them south along a railroad embankment. He found another 300 near La Fière. He spent D-Day walking back and forth between positions separated by several miles, organizing troops from different regiments who had never trained together and directing assaults under continuous fire. What followed at La Fière Bridge was, according to the official history, probably the bloodiest small unit struggle in the experience of American arms. And out of the stone bridge over the flooded Murderette, connected to a 500-yard elevated causeway, the only solid crossing for miles. Without it, American forces from Utah Beach could not push west to cut off the Cotentin Peninsula. Elements of the 505th seized the East End on D-Day morning. A German counterattack hit at 4 in the afternoon. 3 captured French Renault tanks with 200 infantry, forcing American prisoners to walk ahead as human shields. Bazooka teams and a 57mm anti-tank gun destroyed all 3 tanks at point-blank range. For 3 days, the Americans clung to the East Bank under continuous artillery and mortar fire. Company A of the 505th's 1st Platoon was reduced to 15 men still fighting under Sergeant William Owens. Casualties mounted hourly. On June 9th, Ridgway told Gavin, "You are in charge." We attack at 09:30. After a 15-minute artillery barrage, the 3rd Battalion of the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment charged across the 500-yard causeway, single file, on an elevated road barely wide enough for a vehicle, fully exposed to interlocking machine gun fire, mortars, and artillery from 3 directions. There was no cover. Men fell, and the men behind them stepped over the bodies and kept going. Private First Class Charles Dolabert of the 325th performed a suicidal covering action. He walked out onto the road in full view of every German weapon, stood upright, and sprayed enemy positions with his Browning automatic rifle until he was cut down. He bought his platoon enough time to reach the West Bank. He received the 82nd Airborne Division's first Medal of Honor of the war. A soldier who witnessed the La Fière assault recalled that the most memorable sight that day was Ridgway, Gavin, and Maloney standing right there where it was the hottest. Every soldier who hit that causeway saw every general officer and the regimental and battalion commanders right there. That was Gavin's leadership in a single image. Standing where the fire was worst. Total casualties at La Fière over 4 days. Approximately 60 killed and 529 wounded, captured, or missing. Some companies lost more than half their strength in the June 9th assault alone. The 82nd fought in Normandy for 33 consecutive days. No relief, no replacements, no rotation. Total Normandy casualties, 5,245 killed, wounded, or missing. Ridgway's after-action report stated it with a kind of plainness that needs no embellishment. 33 days of action without relief, without replacements. Every mission accomplished, no ground gained was ever relinquished. This is the part most histories skip. While the 101st Airborne gets the documentary treatment and the cultural real estate, the 82nd was in combat a full year before the Screaming Eagles ever jumped. It made 4 combat jumps to the 101st too. It logged 422 days of combat across 7 campaigns. It took higher total casualties. But it never had its Band of Brothers moment in popular culture. In my view, that is partly because Gavin himself was not interested in self-promotion after the war. He was interested in ideas. He wrote books about missile defense and nuclear strategy. The cameras found one story. The record tells another. When Ridgway moved up to command the 18th Airborne Corps in August 1944, he recommended Gavin as his successor. Gavin took command of the 82nd Airborne Division at age 37 and was promoted to temporary Major General on October 20th, still 37, making him the youngest Major General to command an American division since George Armstrong Custer in the Civil War. To put that in context, Maxwell Taylor, commanding the 101st Airborne, was 42. Raymond Barton of the 4th Infantry Division was 54. Norman Cota, the legendary Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division on Omaha Beach, was 51. Gavin was a full decade younger than nearly every peer in a comparable position. His first test as division commander was Market Garden, and it was the most controversial action of his career. The 82nd drew the most complex mission of the entire operation: capture the Grave Bridge over the Maas, seize canal bridges over the Maas-Wall Canal, take the massive Nijmegen Bridge over the Waal River, one of the longest bridges in Europe, and hold the Groesbeek Heights, the dominant terrain overlooking all of it, against potential counterattacks from the Reichswald forest to the east. 4 major objectives spread across miles of Dutch countryside. Gavin made his 4th combat jump on September 17, 1944, and fractured 2 vertebrae in his spine on landing. He did not report or treat the injury for nearly 2 months. He fought the entire campaign with a broken back. The Grave Bridge and 1 canal bridge were captured intact on the first day. The Groesbeek Heights were secured. But the Nijmegen Bridge was not taken on the first day, and that is the decision that follows Gavin's name in every serious analysis of Market Garden. Here is the honest assessment. Gavin prioritized holding the Groesbeek Heights over rushing the Nijmegen Bridge. His reasoning was defensible. Intelligence reported up to 1,000 German tanks potentially staged in the Reichswald, and the heights dominated the entire operational area. Losing them meant losing everything. Landing zones for the next day's reinforcements had to be secured, or the division would receive no resupply, no glider artillery, and no additional troops. Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, commanding the 1st Airborne Corps, had given Gavin priorities that listed the heights first, and the Wall Bridge last. The threat proved real. On September 18th, the Germans overran a drop zone and threatened another. The 508th barely retook them before the second lift arrived. If those zones had been lost, the 82nd would have been stranded without reinforcement. But critics have a point too. The Nijmegen Bridge was virtually undefended for hours on the first day. A swift coup de main by even a single battalion could have taken it. By the time the 508th moved toward it in late afternoon, after a 7-hour delay compounded by miscommunication with its commander, SS reinforcements had crossed from Arnhem and fortified the approaches. The 36-hour delay in capturing the bridge fatally slowed 30 Corps' advance toward Arnhem, where the British 1st Airborne Division was being destroyed. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, who held the north end of the Arnhem Bridge with dwindling forces, it later wrote that the worst mistake of the plan was the failure to prioritize capturing the Nijmegen Bridge. Gavin himself expressed regret to associates, saying he wished he had sent Tucker's battle-hardened 504th instead of the 508th. In my view, Gavin made a defensible but imperfect decision under competing pressures and incomplete intelligence. Browning's orders gave him cover. The drop zone threat validated his concern, but the delay at Nijmegen cost irreplaceable hours. Market Garden was a bad plan given to good divisions, and Gavin made the best of a deeply flawed operation. His one mistake does not erase what came next, because what came next was one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in the entire war. After 2 days of failed frontal attacks on the fortified bridge approaches, Gavin ordered an assault crossing of the 400-yard-wide Waal River in broad daylight. Major Julian Cook, 27 years old, led the 3rd Battalion of the 504th in 26 collapsible canvas boats. Each boat carried 10 paratroopers and 3 combat engineers paddling with 8 canoe paddles. Some men used rifle butts, others used their helmets. A smokescreen was laid at 14:55 hours. The first wave launched 2 minutes later under direct fire from machine guns, 20mm flak cannons, mortars, and artillery, positioned on the far bank and the bridge itself. Cook heard his lieutenants rowing to the rhythm of the rosary. More than half of the 260 troops in the first wave were killed or wounded during the crossing. Only about half the boats made it to the far bank. Many sank, and men drowned in the wall weighed down by equipment. The survivors clawed ashore, stormed German positions with bayonets and grenades, and fought 4,000 yards north to capture the far end of the Nijmegen Bridge from behind. War correspondent Bill Downs of CBS compared the action in magnificence and courage with Guam, Tarawa, and Omaha Beach. 48 paratroopers were killed in the crossing alone. The soldiers called it Little Omaha. And then British 30 Corps tanks, having finally crossed the captured bridge, stopped for the night. They did not push to Arnhem, 11 miles away. 504th veteran Gene Metcalf summed up the fury decades later, in the specific way that men carry betrayal for 50 years, and then speak it plainly when someone finally asks. The British were supposed to close the gap, but they stopped. Born 82nd Airborne casualties during Market Garden, 1,432 killed, wounded, and missing in 9 days. After the operation, British Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, commanding the Second Army, called the 82nd the finest division in the world today. When the German Ardennes offensive struck on December 16, 1944, Gavin was at dinner in Sisson, France. The 82nd was supposed to be resting. He made the critical decision that shaped the American response. The 82nd on the northern shoulder of the Bulge facing the main SS Panzer thrust, the 101st to Bastogne. The 82nd arguably drew the harder assignment. Bastogne got the press. But the northern shoulder was where the 6th SS Panzer Army, including the feared Kampfgruppe Piper of the 1st SS Panzer Division, was trying to break through to the Meuse River crossings. Lead elements of the 82nd arrived in Werbemont roughly 24 hours after alert, having traveled over 100 miles by truck through rain and fog. They deployed across a 25-mile front in freezing temperatures without winter gear. Jump boots designed for warm weather drops allowed no room for extra socks. Men stuffed straw into their boots and wrapped their feet in burlap sacks. Frostbite was epidemic. There was no hot food for days. Many of these men had not been home since 1943. They had fought in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy, in Holland, and now they were in the Ardennes in December in summer uniforms with no winter overcoats, no overshoes, and no white camouflage. During the Bulge, Gavin crawled from foxhole to foxhole, checking on soldiers in sub-zero temperatures. He refused to command from a heated building while his men froze in holes. He wrote to his daughter Barbara that he had always written to the family of every boy who was killed, so by then he had an awful heap of letters to write. That sentence, written in the middle of the worst winter fighting of the war, tells you everything about who this man was. He was not writing memos. He was not positioning himself for promotion. He was writing condolence letters to mothers and fathers, one at a time, in his own hand. On January 3, 1945, the 82nd launched its counterattack. They overran 2 German divisions and captured 2,400 prisoners on the first day alone. 82nd Bulge casualties, 1,824 total. The 504th earned its second Presidential Unit citation, the first such citation won by any American unit in the Battle of the Bulge. The 82nd then crashed through the Siegfried Line in the Rhineland campaign and advanced deep into Germany. The fighting in the Rhineland was different from anything the division had done before. This was not airborne warfare. This was conventional ground combat, grinding through fortified positions, clearing pillboxes, crossing rivers under fire. And the 82nd did it as well as any infantry division in the theater, which tells you something important about what Gavin had built. It was not just an elite airborne unit. It was an elite fighting unit, full stop, capable of anything the Army asked in any configuration under any conditions. On May 2, 1945, the division covered 36 miles in a single day. He's driving deep into Mecklenburg. Lieutenant General Kurt von Tippelskirch's 21st German Army, over 150,000 men, surrendered to the 82nd. It was one of the largest mass surrenders in the European theater. Von Tippelskirch arrived at Gavin's command post, saw a slim young officer in a faded jumpsuit with an M1 rifle slung over his shoulder, and said he was too young and did not look like a general. It took only a moment to change his mind. That same day, the division liberated Wubelin concentration camps near Ludwigslust. What the paratroopers found there was beyond anything combat had prepared them for. Approximately 1,000 inmates were found dead, their bodies stacked in open pits or scattered across the compound. Survivors were skeletal, weighing as little as 60 or 70 pounds. Some had resorted to cannibalism. There were no gas chambers at Wubelin, no crematoria, just starvation, deliberate and total. Gavin's response was immediate. He ordered the townspeople of Ludwigslust to visit the camp and see what had been done in their name. He ordered them to dig graves and bury the dead with their own hands. A funeral was held on the town square for 200 victims, attended by captured German generals who were forced to stand in the front row and watch. Gavin had the bodies exhumed from mass graves and reburied in individual plots in the town's public gardens, so that the citizens of Ludwigslust would have to walk past them every day. That was not policy. That was Gavin. After VE Day, the 82nd was selected for Berlin occupation duty, the ultimate mark of prestige among the divisions of the European theater. And General George Patton, reviewing the 82nd Honor Guard, declared that in all his years in the Army and all the honor guards he had ever seen, the 82nd was undoubtedly the best. That earned the division its enduring nickname, America's Guard of Honor. Let me lay out the full picture in hard numbers, because the numbers are what separate legend from record. 422 days of combat, fourth most of 73 American divisions in the European theater, 7 campaigns, 4 combat jumps, twice as many as any other American airborne division, 9,073 battle casualties, including 1,992 killed in action, roughly 200,000 German prisoners taken, 7 major river crossings under fire, 4 medals of honor, 37 distinguished service crosses, and 898 silver stars, 1,894 bronze stars, 15 distinguished unit citations, and the defining statistic, the one that Ridgway put in his after-action report and that Gavin lived by from Piazza Ridge to the Rhineland: no ground gained was ever relinquished, not once, not in 422 days. Gavin did not just train hard men. He created a culture where leadership meant going first into danger. Officers carried the heavy rifle. Officers jumped first. Officers ate last. And the commanding general, the man with 2 stars on his helmet, was as likely to be found in a foxhole as in a command post. Most division commanders in the European theater led from a command post. They studied maps, issued orders through staff officers, and visited the front when conditions allowed. This was not incompetence, it was doctrine. A major general's job was to coordinate thousands of men across miles of front. Gavin rejected that framework entirely. His philosophy, laid out clearly in his own writings, was that a commander must be where the crisis is, not behind it, not reading about it on a situation map, at it in person, with a weapon in his hands. He believed soldiers fought harder when they could see their general sharing the danger, and he believed that a commander physically present at the critical point made better decisions than one reading reports from 3 miles back. This was not recklessness. Gavin was precise about where he went and when. Now he moved to the point of decision, the place where the battle would be won or lost, and he stayed there until the situation was resolved. At Piazza Ridge, that meant standing on a hilltop with no armor support against 17 Tiger tanks. At La Fière, that meant walking back and forth across open ground between 2 positions under continuous mortar fire. At Market Garden, that meant jumping with a broken back and commanding a division for 2 months without mentioning it to anyone. In December 1947, 8 months before President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 desegregating the military, Gavin ordered the all-black 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, known as the Triple Nickels, integrated into the 82nd Airborne Division. Colonel Bradley Biggs later called Gavin the most colorblind Army officer in the entire military. The 82nd was the first integrated combat division in American military history, and it happened because Gavin decided it should. After the war, he became the youngest lieutenant general since the Civil War, served as Deputy Chief of Staff for Research and Development, and pioneered helicopter air assault tactics that would define the Vietnam War a decade later. He pushed hard for Army investment in missile technology and tactical nuclear delivery systems at a time when most of the senior leadership still thought in terms of World War II formations. He was, as he had always been, ahead of everyone else in the room. But in January 1958, at the pinnacle of his career, with a 4th star and the Army Chief of Staff position within reach, he resigned. The Eisenhower administration's New Look policy, all favoring massive nuclear retaliation over conventional forces, was a doctrine Gavin believed would lead to catastrophe. He wrote that strategic nuclear weapons served no sane purpose other than causing hundreds of millions of deaths. He argued that the United States needed flexible conventional forces capable of fighting limited wars, not a single button that ended civilization. He was right. The next decade proved it. Vietnam was exactly the kind of war the New Look was incapable of fighting. He did not play politics. He did not trim his views to keep his career alive. He had fought his way from an orphanage to the command of the most decorated division in the American Army, and when the system demanded that he endorse a strategy he believed was insane, he walked away at 51 years old, with everything still ahead of him. Most men in that position would have kept their mouths shut, taken the 4th star, and written a critical memoir 20 years later. Gavin could not do that. He was the same man who had refused to carry a carbine when his soldiers carried Garands. The same man who jumped first out of every door. The principle was identical at every level of his life. If you would not do it yourself, you had no right to ask anyone else to do it. President Kennedy appointed him ambassador to France in 1961. He is credited with suggesting the idea for the Peace Corps during the 1960 campaign. He became one of the most visible former military critics of the Vietnam War, testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about exactly the strategic failures he had predicted in 1958. He died on February 23, 1990, at age 82, of complications from Parkinson's disease. He is buried at West Point Cemetery. His gravestone features a Master Parachutist badge with 4 combat jump stars. He was born without a name his parents intended to keep. He left school at 14. He ran away at 17. He educated himself at 4:30 in the morning in a bathroom because it was the only room with enough light. He wrote the Army's first manual on airborne warfare, then jumped into combat 4 times to prove every page of it. He commanded the most decorated division in the European theater at 37 years old. He integrated that division years before the law required it. He resigned rather than endorse a strategy he knew was wrong, and through all 422 days, through Sicily and Salerno and Normandy and Holland and the Ardennes and the Rhineland and Berlin, not 1 foot of ground his division took was ever given back. The Army did not plan to put a 37-year-old orphan from a Pennsylvania coal town in charge of its most elite division. The war demanded it. And for 422 days, James Gavin proved that the system's reluctance was the only thing that had ever been wrong.